Okay, I think hello everyone, and it's time to start, and it's time to introduce our big friend, Dr. Andy Curtis, who is planning to have 3 sessions with TESOL Ukraine and grant us a wonderful opportunity for teacher development. And you remember that last time we asked in our chat about the questions, and those were the questions by Ludmila Knapovska and by whose other question was it? By Lana Krasavitska, yeah? So about assessment. So these are the two people who inspired the session. And today, Dr. Andy Curtis is going to tell us more about his ideas and the sphere. And yeah, so I see a hat from Ludmila, and probably Lada is here as well, or she will be joining here. So please meet Dr. Curtis, and I am giving floor to him, please.
Thank you very much, Mariana. It's great to be back. I know it is another Friday night there, and it's noon here in Canada. It's cold by Canadian standards, but very bright and sunny. And it is, above all else, a very peaceful day here, which people in this part of the world are learning to appreciate in ways that perhaps they haven't appreciated before. A boring day is a good day here. It means that nothing bad has happened. So it is lovely to see you again. We were talking beforehand. I hope to get to see you in person, possibly this summer. In the meantime, this will have to do, and this is I think online teaching and learning, it does provide a lot of opportunities for connection when face-to-face is not possible. So it's my second time. This is the second of 3 talks. There will be another talk that I'll be giving before the end of the month. Today, as Mariana said, inspired by your questions and your comments, I was asked to talk about assessment, which is this massive topic. And last time in late January, I talked about intercultural communication, which is also this massive topic. So I'm getting good at big topics. So my apologies for not, I didn't decide until the last few days what to talk about today, because assessment is such a big topic, it's such an important topic. So as you can see from the first slide, and I hope you can see that, I'm going to assume you can, there's this idea of ecosystems. Now, if any of you are familiar with the notion of ecosystems, do please let me know. I come from a biomedical background, as I mentioned on my first talk. My first degrees are in clinical medicine, not a typical background for an English language teacher, but it has given me many opportunities to look at language and language classrooms and language teachers and learners as these living, organic, dynamic entities. So the question, if you remember one thing from today, and I know you're all very busy, and I often ask my students, what is one thing you think you'll remember? A month or 3 months or 6 months or whatever. So if you remember one thing from today, this notion of ecosystems, I think is worth remembering. It's becoming very popular in much of the literature. And once something becomes popular in the literature, I get very suspicious. But ecosystems, for me, coming from a biomedical background, actually makes sense. So this notion that teaching and learning and assessment, and as I mentioned, I've been asked to speak on assessment, and I'm very happy to speak on assessment, is this notion of, I think it's partly because we're really concerned about what we're doing to the planet. So this notion of symbiosis and symbiotic relationships in our classrooms has become more and more important. If you go to conferences or you read papers from North America or other parts of Europe or elsewhere, then you will see this notion of ecosystems coming up a lot, which is the borrowing from the biomedical sciences, which happens to be my background, and this idea that classrooms and students and teachers and language and culture are organic, dynamic entities changing from moment to moment. So if we approach teaching and learning and assessment with the idea of ecosystems as these organic and dynamic entities, how does that change our understanding? That's one of the questions that we'll be contemplating today. So I'm assuming you can all see me and hear me okay. I can see you and hear you. I will attempt to juggle the chat bar. There's about 50 something of you and one of me, but I really would like these sessions to be interactive. So this notion, if you remember one thing, and especially if you're looking for areas to write about or present on or publish on, ecosystems is the current flavor in international language education. So thank you again to Marina and Lena for organizing the session. I've been learning a phrase, I hope I get it right. Slava Ukraini. Slava
Україні, так, слава Україні. Yeah.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям
So,
слава.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
for me, these are opportunities to learn. So I rewatched and made notes, and thank you so much for being so efficient on posting these sessions. I rewatched my session that we did and took notes. I have my notes, and then I watched and made notes on the follow-up session. Because when we talk about lifelong learning, and we're like, oh yeah, everybody should be a lifelong learner, sure. But how do we demonstrate that? So for me, this relationship with TESOL-Ukraine is becoming a big part of my lifelong learning. So I rewatched the video of myself, which is a very uncomfortable experience. If any of you have seen yourself teaching on video, you will know what an uncomfortable experience that is. But it is, as a presenter, it really is the best way, the most painful and the most efficient way of improving your presentation skills, really, is to see yourself on video. And I know you do that with your students. And then I listened to a couple of times and took notes on the following session. So I listened to and made notes on the 3 presentations. Obviously, Lena is with us here today. I learned a lot from Ala's session and from Irina's session. So thank you for that. A quick bio, if you want the detailed bio, you can see our previous recording from late January. Having spent 30-something years in dozens of countries and hundreds of publications to tens of thousands of people, I'm not very comfortable with the notion of being an expert. Many of my friends in this field, they love being introduced as experts. I'm not myself very comfortable because I have some expertise in a few areas, but I'm not an expert in you. in your context, in your day-to-day classroom realities. I don't know anything about that. That's why I give these talks, so you can teach me about those things. So I present myself more as a resource than an expert. And for today's session and our third session later this month, I will be doing the same, which is to say that rather than giving you a talk on what you should be doing on testing and assessment in Ukraine, I prefer to give input and then have that input be the source of question and answer. It's a slightly different approach to teacher development. It's not something we would do in the classroom, but when I'm working with teachers at this level, I present myself more as a resource than as an expert, though I do have some expertise. And all human languages, I'm very interested in anthropology and psychology and history. As far as we know, all human languages are based on question and answer. We have not yet discovered a human language that is not fundamentally premised on question and answer. So for my talks in recent years, I tend to go for a 1-to-3 ratio, in which if I present for 30 minutes, then I allow 15 minutes of Q&A. If I present for more time or less time. So if all human languages are based on question and answer, it's the Q&A where some of the deepest and longest lasting learning may occur. Again, we won't necessarily do this in our classrooms, but for these sessions, I think it's my approach to give some input based on my expertise and then really learn from the Q&A. So those of you who were here at my talk previously will know that I'm very big on context. I come across too much research and too many presentations which are context independent, which is to say they don't seem to really know and study the context. So for you, for us together this evening, it's a Ukrainian context. So I spent some time looking at the topic in your context. So this is a paper. It's 2014, so 10 years ago now, about Ukrainian teachers or Ukrainian perspective on the assessing the competence of university foreign language teachers. So your first task for this evening, because I imagine you've had a long and challenging week, and this is to be interactive. If you know this paper, if you read it and you're familiar with the paper or the authors, please just type yes into or Y into the chat bar. And if this is new to you, then type no. And I understand this is cultural because some people may not want to publicly display that they don't know this, but I'm trying to assess, the talk is about assessment. I'm trying to assess what you do and don't know. So if you're all familiar with this paper, then I can skip over it and don't need to spend as much time on it. So Ludmila says yes, Irina says yes, Ala says yes. Wonderful. Okay, so let's skip over. So those of you who said yes, you see, this is the danger of saying you know stuff. Who would like to type into the chat bar the Bologna process? Because for the last 10 years in Ukraine, language, not just language, but for the last 10 years in Ukraine, testing and assessment has been governed by this Bologna process. So would anyone like to share with the group as to what is the Bologna from Italy, when I cook, and I like to cook, um, there's a bolognese sauce, which is an Italian sauce. So Bologna is a place in Italy, and there was a thing called the Bologna process, which was introduced into the Ukrainian education system 10 years ago in 2014, and has influenced assessment and even testing over these 10 years. So those of you who said you're familiar with the paper, which is wonderful, does anyone want to um, drop a line into the chat bar as to what was or what is, in fact, the Bologna process? There is a clue on the screen. The idea behind the Bologna process, or the ministerial meetings that took place, was that there would be a set of standards across Europe where if someone got a language score in this country, say in Ukraine for English, it would be understood in, say, Italy or France or Spain or anywhere else in Europe. So this paper, assessing the competence of university foreign teachers, was about that, was about the Bologna process and this attempt to standardize across European countries, as Ludmilla said, new standards of assessment and standardized assessment. This idea that within the 24 plus countries of Europe, and that's what led to the CEFR, which we will be talking about today. So another pop quiz. Yes, as Imina mentioned, the CEFR is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So that was 10 years ago, and that was about standardizing across European countries assessments and outcomes, learning, what I would call learning outcomes. And the, as Ina and Elena have said, about standardizing across Europe. It was a sad day for me. I will admit to you, having been born and raised in England, it was a sad day for me when the UK voted to no longer be part of the European Union as such. That was a difficult day for me. That was a day when I was glad to be living in Canada, because I think that was a mistake. But we have the Common European Framework of References, of Reference for Languages, the CFR, and I have gone to village schools in China, and I have gone to village schools in India and had people ask me about the CEFR. Isn't that wild? The Common European Framework is now being discussed in villages in China and India. So it's a very powerful thing. It came into Ukraine about 10 years ago, and it's been shaping your assessments. So 1 year ago, a paper came out in probably the most prestigious journal in the field, which was about the new ULP, which is something I had to learn about, launched in the summer of 2021. So we're coming up to 3 years, the Ukrainian language proficiency test, which interestingly doesn't contain the words Ukrainian or foreign language, which I thought was interesting. But the full paper is available if you have an internet connection. So because of my concerns with context, I do spend a lot of time, in this case, if it's a particular topic, to be presented to teachers in a particular country, learning about that. So the new test, and if any of you are preparing students to take that test, that would be really interesting. Please do let me know, or type yes into the chat box if any of you are preparing It says civil servants and citizens who are naturalized. And in fact, when we spoke the last presentation at the end of January, we talked about, somebody asked some specific questions about immigrants from other countries. So this is a powerful test, one that you may not necessarily be teaching for. If you're English language teachers, you'll be teaching for TOEFL and IELTS and other tests, but this is an important test in your context. So they talked about the Ukrainian language proficiency test being meaningful, and meaningfulness having been defined by Anthony Coonan, who is a friend and colleague in language assessment. So one of the things we can talk about today, if you like, is the notion of meaningfulness and validity in our classroom assessments. They made two other claims, again, using Anthony's work from 2018, about it being meaningful in terms of construct and task. And this notion of fairness has become really important. I tend to give professional language testers a hard time because I don't think fairness was a big thing in language testing. They were about reliability, they were about validity. I don't know how concerned they were about test fairness, but it's become a big thing, test fairness. And are we assessing our students in meaningful terms? Are we assessing our students fairly? So these are, to skip back, some of the work that I've been reading to prepare for today's talk in terms of testing and assessment of language in your context. So I looked at 10 years ago, I looked at 1 year ago, I looked at 2 months ago. This is a paper from a university in Ukraine. Again, some of you may know it. But as I mentioned last time when we were together, I'm not always very comfortable when someone turns up in my country, whichever country that happens to be, and starts talking to me about assessment or intercultural communication, and it becomes clear they haven't really researched my context. So that's a big thing for me. So that's why I went 10 years ago, 1 year ago, 2 months ago. So the author of this paper talked about test writing literacy, which has become a big thing. Can classroom teachers write a good test item? And I've written test items for some of the largest language testing companies in the world. And I have to tell you, writing a really good test item is actually very difficult. So interpreting the results, writing the test item, these are all challenges that teachers there and in many other places are facing. The paper discussed, the one from 2 months ago, Ukrainian university teachers' knowledge and skills in terms of assessment and evaluation. And they referred to the still classic paper, nearly 30 years later, of Alderson, Clapham, and Wall, which we'll look at a little bit today as part of my input, hopefully leading to Q&A that will be helpful and useful to you. The two books that have shaped today's talk, this is one of them. Those of you who may know Professor Kathy Bailey, another past president of TESOL, we updated a book a few years ago, a 350-page book, on learning about language assessment, but it was the subtitle that I thought was really interesting: Dilemmas, Decisions and Directions. And I was a bit surprised to see that that is also 10 years old. Another book is this one by Liying Chung and Jana Fox. I was the series editor, about assessment in the language classroom. So the rest of the input for today will be influenced by those particular books and many others, as well as the context in which you are doing your testing and assessment. Within this idea of ecosystems, of an organic relationship, I mentioned when we were last together my clinical medical background, as a result of which I see language and language classrooms as living, breathing, organic, dynamic entities. And this is equally true as it applies to concepts of classroom assessment. Not so much to concepts of large scale standardized testing, in which context is less important. So, washback, as referred to by even the most recent papers written by teachers in Ukraine. So, these 15 famous statements that they made. And it really is interesting to reflect on them from some 30 years ago. A test will influence teaching and learning, influence what and how teachers teach, influence what and how learners learn. More specifically, the test and the assessment will influence the rate and sequence, the degree and depth, attitudes, and consequences. And Professor Liying Chung, the first author of this book, who has been teaching me about language assessment for the last 25 years, does a lot of work on washback. And washback is the relationship between how we do testing and assessment and how that shapes what we do in the classroom with our learners. So, washback, this is a recent publication, but the influence of testing on teaching and learning is a big part of this ecosystem that I mentioned before. How do testing and assessment influence teaching and learning? And within a healthy, thriving ecosystem, they feed into each other and come out of each other in these mutually beneficial ways. Validity, of course, is one of the essential pillars of any discussion of testing and assessment. So I did want to touch on that notion of validity, which to me really means, are we testing and assessing what we think we're testing and assessing? There are many studies over many countries and many years where the assessments, even if they're positive, don't necessarily reflect what the teacher had in mind. So there have been some lovely studies where students have had a language lesson and other lessons, content lessons, and the teachers come out of one room and they're put into a room with researchers, and the students come out of the room and they're put into another room with researchers, and the researchers said to the students, what was it that you learned today in your class, in your lesson? And the students were very good. They had, we learned all these different things. And then they asked the teachers of those students, what did you teach today? And the teachers had all these really good answers, but you can probably guess that they were not necessarily connected. What the teachers said and thought they were teaching was not necessarily what the learners said they learned. So one of the crucial functions of assessment is, how can we connect those two? What it is that we teach in relation to what it is that our students learn. That's probably the most important role of classroom assessment rather than standardized testing is how do we narrow the gap between those two in terms of validity and reliability. Samuel Messick, as some of you will know, showing off his short sleeves, long arms, and expensive watch, still has a huge influence on the notion of validity. Essentially, for me, as a classroom teacher, validity means, are we testing and assessing what we think we are? So if we've spent a whole week teaching the simple past or the past progressive, future conditionals, some particular grammar point or idioms or colloquial, so we've spent a whole week, and then on Friday we assess the students' learning of what we've been teaching. That's where the validity really comes in terms of the different kinds of validity, the evidence, and the consequence. Those two things are really key, this notion of evidence and consequence. So these are some of the questions that I contemplate and that I work with other teachers in other countries. So when we assign our students a grade, and I assume all of you assign your students grades, what does that mean in terms of what we would call construct validity? What does the grade mean? There's also the notion of relevance, what we would call in testing and assessment the value of the grade as it's assigned and what it means, and then the social consequences. If it's national exams, and these exams decide whether students will get into university, for example, then the social consequences are very significant. And Ling Chang and I have written a lot about the social consequences of testing in education systems that are driven by large, standardized, national or even international testing like TOEFL and IELTS. So those are some of the questions that I think, are still struggling with, and I think are still worth asking about our day-to-day testing and assessment. I won't go into detail for this table, but the slides are already with TESOL-Ukraine, and there'll be a recording if you wanted to look more carefully at this. But it looks at the difference between large-scale assessment, such as TOEFL, IELTS, and national exams, like the ULP that we were looking at earlier, and the differences between those and classroom assessment as it happens between teachers and students in those moment-to-moment realities of day-to-day teaching and learning. So that's a helpful table in terms of comparing and contrasting those similarities and differences. So again, this notion of ecosystems, we used to talk in the field a lot about alignment, aligning our teaching and learning with our testing and assessment. So there was a lot of talk about alignment, I noticed in presentations and publications, and that notion of alignment seems to have moved to something that is more organic and more dynamic, which for me makes sense as language as a living, breathing entity. So this notion of symbiosis is the opposite, in biological terms, it's the opposite of parasitism. In parasitism, one organism is feeding off another to the detriment of the host. But the organic and ecological system of symbiosis, the idea or the metaphor or analogy, is that it's mutually beneficial. a symbiotic relationship is an organic and mutually beneficial one. So that's been, I think, a big shift during the times of COVID and during times of conflict. There are effects on internationalization, migration, and immigration. So, how is what we're doing in our testing and assessing reflecting that and being influenced by that? And then what Li Ying and her colleagues call the geopolitics of assessment, because there are political implications. Teaching and learning a language is a political act. That's not my statement. That's a statement of people like Diane Lawson Freeman and a number of others, that to teach and learn a language is in fact a political act. So the geopolitics of assessment in relation, for example, to immigration are more prevalent now in the discussions, in the research, in the publications, and the presentations. So this re-examining of the relationships between teaching and learning, and testing, between teaching and learning and assessment, within this notion of alignment, and then beyond alignment, this notion of ecosystems that are dynamic and organic reflections of the world around us. And certainly artificial intelligence and generative AI in many of the countries in which I work is having an impact on how we test, on how we assess, on how we think of classrooms and language and teaching and learning as this ecological system. And one of the interesting things about this new idea of ecosystems, which is becoming very prevalent, I would say even dominant, is that if you are just one part of an ecosystem, so I look out my window, it's a sunny, cold, clear blue sky winter day here, calm and peaceful and quiet. But if I go out and I cut all the trees down, that will have effects on the ecosystem in ways that we cannot yet interpret. So that's how we're now thinking about testing and assessment in those ecological ideas. So I think we're at an interesting and challenging point in the way we think about large-scale language testing, in the way we think about classroom assessment, how we think about those complicated relationships in ways that we didn't necessarily think of them before. So the future, in terms of my work or Professor Li and Clum's work, or those of us working in the field of testing and assessment, we are going to try and look more holistically at things like the environment, like the context, like the geography, like the politics, of how, who, what, where, and how, when, and why. Those 6 key questions: who, what, where, how, when, and why, as applied to everything from large-scale international testing to classroom assessment. So I did promise that I'd like to try and keep my promise that, so I've left what I hope is enough time for questions and answers. That's quite a lot of stuff to think about in your context and in the broader context, but I would love to spend our remaining time. If you have any particular questions, you can type them in, you can unmute. I would love to hear you or hear from you.
So Andy, thank you very much for your insightful and thought-provoking talk. My question is, what do you think of online assessment formats? How much has assessment changed since distance learning has been introduced in a full-scale format? And the most important thing is how to stick to the principles of academic integrity while we are assessing students online. This is my
Yeah,
first question. And the second question is, well, just one of the issues that one of our colleagues suggested for discussion was assessment of creative projects. In fact, creativity is something that lies out of the scope of the language, but how can we integrate assessing creativity and language skills?
thank you very much, Ludmilla, for those two big and very pertinent questions. One of the companies I work with as a consultant is called Duolingo, and all of their learning systems are on the phone. They started off Duolingo, if you know them, as a small niche app, mostly for people planning to go to another country to learn enough language to interact with hotel staff and waiters. And then COVID came, and Duolingo became this massive program, which is now being used for university entrance in a number of countries in the US and Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. But their test security has been a huge challenge because it's on your mobile phone. So certainly test security is a very big issue with online testing. Now, online assessment is a bit different, but if we're talking about test conditions, many of the world's largest testing companies are trying to develop online testing systems. For example, the Duolingo app that I've been helping to develop, if anybody, there's a camera on the phone or a camera on the computer, if anybody else appears in the camera shot, they disqualify you from the exam. If you look away from the screen for too long, or if there's any evidence of anybody else being involved, you are automatically disqualified. So some companies are doing retinal scans, which is very advanced. That's probably the leading edge, where there is a scan of your retina, which sounds like something from a Mission Impossible movie. But some companies are looking at retinal scans to make sure that the person who takes the test is actually the real person. So to your first question, test security and cheating is a huge challenge when we're testing online. And the testing companies are trying to address those issues of test security and trying to ensure that the tests have the same level of integrity and trust. That's a very difficult thing. If you bring a group of students to a language testing center and they're all there, you can see them, you know who they are. There's also this notion of what's being called remote proctoring, an odd word, from the Latin, of course. So this idea of students in different countries coming to test centers and doing the test online but live, and having someone making sure that they're not cheating. But certainly test security is a very big issue with online assessments. I also think that the way we assess our learners' work has to change. If I have 30 or 40 students in my class, then I'm not going to be able to assess them the same way as if I'm there in person. Because if I'm in the class in person and we're all together in a physical space and it's a language classroom, then I can see, are they using the target language? How are they interacting? How are they using the target language? How little of their first language are they using compared to the target language? So there are some very big challenges and very big differences with online testing and with online assessment, not just for languages, but for other subjects as well. Your second question, if you remind me, Ludmila, your second question was?
That was about how to integrate assessing language and creativity. Just if we engage students in developing projects, research projects, which require a good deal of creativity, then what kind of criteria can we apply?
Yeah, I think that's, again, a very good and very big question, which is, and in fact, I'm having some very challenging but interesting discussions about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, because some people are claiming that ChatGPT, which I'm assuming is there in Ukraine, but if it's not, you should let me know. Some people are saying that ChatGPT and generative AI is creative. And I'm one of those people saying, actually, I don't know that it is. I don't know that ChatGPT and generative AI, because to be truly creative means to produce something that has never been produced by anybody ever, anywhere. And that's very, very hard to do. So I think true creativity of the kind that we might see, let's say, with an artist like Picasso, or with originality and creativity, are very difficult to assess. But I have had, in language classrooms, I have had students do creative writing. So short stories, poetry in their own language, in another language. So I think originality is just very difficult, but I think creativity is possible to assess when the students use the language in a way that is unusual. I'm trying to think of a good example of where my students have been creative in ways that I didn't expect. But the notion of, so my first point is that I think the new technologies are not yet creative, and I think human creativity is still a very special thing which the technology cannot yet replicate. How we assess the creativity in their language, in my work, in my publications, I will create new words. I will combine words and create new words, which is a fairly extreme form of linguistic creativity. So I think creativity is possible. I think it is reflected in language. I think it's difficult to assess whether it's online or in person, but I think it is possible if students use the language in a way that is not incorrect, but it is used in a way that I was not expecting.
Well, I can share my example of this. My master students who were taking a course in English for professional purposes, their final task was to design a project, and they were supposed to pretend they have written a book on management, and they were supposed to come up with a catchy title for this book, and the requirement was for them just to invent a buzzword that would be a blend. Like just we have globalization, and they came up with a good deal of creative ideas. I remember one team just were talking about management, and that was the concept of black management on the analogy with black PR, and they just based their book on that, and they explained what blandishment is about, blah, blah, blah. Well, and I was supposed to assess this, and what I did, I assessed both the content and their presentation skills. Frankly speaking, that was pretty difficult for me. I mean, the content, because I'm not a specialist in management. I'm not a specialist in just in their sphere, but I was assessing it from the point of view of how innovative and creative it all sounded. And I should say that in many cases, this is a pretty subjective assessment. I don't know how to make it as objective as possible.
And that's a great example. I subscribe to some dictionary websites, and some of them send me almost every day, or certainly a few times a week, new words that are being used, usually on social media. Social media is this very interesting place for seeing new words. So I think you're right. I think when you're assessing creativity and originality, it is going to be somewhat subjective, because creativity requires originality, and if something is new, there's no precedent, there's no prior criteria on which to base it. So I think there is going to be an element of subjectivity, but the kind of examples that you gave, where they're combining different areas and then coming up with some new language, some linguistic creativity. So I don't think that, certainly that will not be covered in the CEFR, which is very much standardized can-do statements. So I think it's okay when we're assessing linguistic and other kinds of creativity to be somewhat subjective, as long as you have examples of the kind that you presented to me. I think that's good. So if someone says, well, how are you, when you say this is creative, what do you mean? And I think rather than giving a definition, giving the kind of example that you gave is actually more helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And one more, that's not perhaps a question, that's a remark and a comment. Well, with online learning and with teaching and learning in an online format for how long? For 4 years already, since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and then just
Yes.
Since the war broke out. Well, my feeling is that this balance between teaching, learning, and assessment, just this ecosystem, as you call it. In fact, before you would introduce this term ecosystem, we used to talk about teaching, learning, and assessment as the basic triangle, right? Ecosystem is just a much better version, just because it's really about being organic synergies between the three elements. Well, and just my feeling is that we have broken this balance within this ecosystem. We are assessing more than we are teaching. We do not have time just to teach them something, and we give them the tasks and we assess something that we didn't manage to teach them before we assess it. And we have shifted more to assessing writing, because they write much in the Google class, on Moodle, whenever they are working on. And very often we ask them to produce something that we haven't worked on. And this is that misbalance or disbalance or lack of balance between teaching, learning, and assessment.
Yeah. Yes, again, a very important point, this disconnect. We see what we're doing to our planet, and we're certainly not being particularly good stewards of our global ecosystems on an environmental level. But I agree. I think one of the challenges of moving to online during times of pandemics, during times of armed conflict and war, is that we ultimately assess what is accessible. And so if writing is the thing that lends itself to being more easily assessed, then that's what we're going to end up assessing. Ultimately, it may come down to what the students are learning the language for. If the students are learning the language, let's say English as an example, to be able to speak and listen in their careers, then our assessments are supposed to reflect that. But it's it's true, and you make an extremely important point that ultimately, and this is not spoken about much in the field, but ultimately we assess what is accessible. And in online teaching and learning, it's writing, because that's the easiest thing to assess online, whereas speaking and listening, the way we're doing now, would be much harder to assess, more labor intensive, more complicated, more challenging. So it's a relationship and a balance between what is accessible in that particular modality and what the students will do in terms of needs analysis, what the students will do with the language if and when they learn it.
And just one more thing, we also assess speaking. Definitely, if we have an online classroom, this is the chance for us to assess them speaking spontaneously. When we give them tasks to record something, then the issue is this is not their spontaneous speech, and we can't be sure that they did it on their own. Maybe they, well, again, this integrity and fairness and validity and reliability and whatever principle we talk about.
Yes, again, a very good summary of the challenges of the balancing it. And I tend to assess my students on both. I say to them, you know, you're going to give a presentation and I'll assess you on that. I know you've rehearsed it and I know it's very spontaneous, but then I also set them tasks in class, in person, rather than online when in person is possible. And then I can do two kinds of assessment. I can assess their, which is much more complicated, but their spontaneity, their creativity um, um, in their speaking and listening. Whereas assessing spontaneity and creativity in writing, as you know, is more difficult. So I tend to have, when I can, multiple layers. The stuff they've rehearsed, which I know they have, like a more formal presentation. And then when it's in class, ideally in person, but sometimes online, the more spontaneous, more creative stuff that they haven't had time to prepare for. That's the big key in the difference between structured and spontaneous is really preparation time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila.
May I intervene? Thank you, Ludmila, and thank you for your answers. But Ludmila is bothered to know maybe the main problem is creativity. While listening to you and the assessment, I start thinking about critical thinking. Whether we can incorporate, especially critical reading, especially master's degree students, or when we assess their writing, because they should demonstrate a piece of critical thinking. Maybe, Andy, you know about any frameworks? How can we assess critical thinking skills, at least evidences, and the level of their development? Because for university students, it is very important.
Yes.
Thank you in
yes.
advance.
Thank you for the question. And this may be another topic, but certainly to respond to the question of critical thinking in relation to creativity is, in my work and in my world, absolutely essential to help develop those. And even in a person's first language, in someone's mother tongue, in their first language, they should be thinking critically. So if someone says to them, this is a bad person, you should harm this person because this is a bad person because they're different. You would hope that the individual would think, well, where is the evidence for what you've just presented to me? So I think there is a very close connection. And thank you again for bringing that up. A very close connection between creativity and critical thinking. How you teach those two things and how you assess those two things, even in a first language, is challenging. How you assess them in a second or foreign or other language, I think is even more challenging. But I do believe that those two things, creativity and critical thinking, are absolutely essential, and they do manifest themselves in language. And at the graduate level that you were mentioning, Irina, in terms of, let's say, graduate student writing, I do tell and encourage my graduate students, whether they're working in their first language or another language, to be critical of what it is they're reading. So when they write about it, they don't just summarize it, they actually make tentative comments that tell me that they're being critical. They are not just accepting everything they're reading. They're not just accepting everything they're told. So that for me is the essence of critical thinking, is, are you asking questions all the time about your input, about what you're reading, about what you're hearing? And language assessment can be helpful for assessing that. But I will say again that those two things are essential, creativity and critical thinking, but they're also two of the hardest things to assess.
Yes, thank you. Why I'm asking, when I was studied postgraduate courses at the University of Exeter, and we wrote reflective assignment, you see, and the assignments by the end of the module. And we said that, for example, as Ukrainians, it was more than 20 years ago, that we are good in logics, we are good in structure and organizing, but we are lacking critical thinking skills. And we ask, if it is a new area for me, teacher-trainer training, how can I criticize such pieces, for example, like Andy Curtis or something? They said, you need to think critically. And since then, I'm trying, first of all, to develop critical thinking within my students. And I'm trying to find at least some criteria. Of course, with the practice, it comes to you, but there is no clear, criteria or descriptors to say, like I understood you, that they need somehow questioning. But if they're great authority in the world, how can I question them in my, for example, assignment or reflective assignment or whatever, or coursework? Maybe a piece of advice how to develop step by step. This maybe some know-hows. I will be very grateful. I hope it will be interesting for everyone. If you help us with some ideas.
I know it's getting late on your Friday evening there, but I would be happy to talk more as another presentation or part of another presentation, because as you said, how do we, once something is printed, once something is in a book, doesn't really matter what book or what language, but once something's printed and once it's in a book, it seems real and true in ways that can be difficult to challenge for people who haven't written books. It makes sense, is that it seems to be, in certain cultures, that might seem rude or impolite or inappropriate. So there's a huge, to go back to our first talk, there's a huge cultural component to what we mean when we say critical thinking. For some people, it's just criticizing, but as we know, critical thinking is more about asking questions, not necessarily challenging openly established thinking, but certainly asking questions. So I would say that both creativity and critical thinking start with asking questions, and where we go from there is another discussion, perhaps. But that would be the starting point.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry for a short and incomplete answer, but an excellent question and perhaps a good starting point.
So, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Andy Curtis, for this wonderful Friday evening. So, in reality, we are tired, but we're always inspired by seeing colleagues, by talking to each other. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And by the way, Ludmila will also go to Tampa and see you there. And Irina participated in Portland, in the conference in Portland last year. So yeah, so we'll have a chance to meet and we'll have a chance to meet by the end of this month. So
Wonderful. I
thank
look
you.
forward to it. Thank you all very much.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
good,
much.
have a good, safe weekend. Take care.
Thank you. And
Thank
take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye
Bye,
to
everyone.
all.
Bye, everyone, and great things.
See you.